Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic is progressivism and reform, as we are finally going to push into the 20th century. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on that video, jot down that lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those keywords at your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off talking about what life was like in the late 19th century. We talked about all the big changes that were going on, especially after the Civil War ended in 1865, and discussing just how much virulent racism was being put on not only African Americans, the traditional story told in U.S. history courses, but also upon Mexicanos. And we examined how, especially when it comes to even labor, they are being viewed as, oh yeah, we love having Mexicanos work as laborers. They are first-class laborers. But when it comes to citizenship, something that they had since prior to the Civil War, they were viewed as second-class citizens, often lumped together with African Americans. But now we're going to push into that very, very tail end of the 19th century and finally into the 20th century. And I mentioned this in the last lecture. Again, there's some big things going on. There's Reconstruction, there's industrialization, there's westward expansion. And the fourth thing I mentioned was imperialism. And I want to pick up with imperialism for a minute, because it's important to understand what's going on with imperialism. Okay, so by the late 19th century, the United States will enter into a new phase in its history. And, well, actually two phases. The first has to do with what's called Taming the West, i.e., taking control of all that land west of the Mississippi by suppressing and displacing both Native Americans and Mexicanos. And again, that's been going on. We've talked about that, quite a bit thus far. And while I've already mentioned alongside industrialization, the end of the century also ushered in a new phase of manifest destiny, i.e., imperialism, becoming an empire. And so, if you recall back to one of our first lectures talking about how manifest destiny was this big push to spread our supposedly superior culture from sea to shining sea, well, we've done that now. By the 1890s, we felt like we accomplished that. In fact, there's a whole literature out there, because there was a historian at the time by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner who published what was called the Frontier Thesis, that said the frontier was a quintessential part of American cultural identity, that Americans had to have a frontier to strive for, to conquer. And if you didn't have a frontier, you would die up. Well, he also argued that by the 1890s, we had tamed our frontier. We had conquered our frontier. And this was done through westward expansion. So then the question becomes, what's next? And if we've successfully manifested our destiny from sea to shining sea, what's next? And the answer was, well, let's push beyond the boundaries of the lower 48 states. Let's push beyond the boundaries and across the ocean. Now, we're going to briefly examine this process of imperialism and then change into how this directly impacts, Mexicanos within this progressive era. So part one is imperialism. Part two is a study of progressivism. So let's start with imperialism. And so a brief recap of this is that we started very slowly. We started with the purchase of Alaska in 1867, an initial purchase that was seen as being stupid. In fact, it was called Seward's Folly. Of course, when gold was discovered in the 1890s, it was all good. When oil was discovered later on, it was all good. And then it accelerated, though, in the 1880s with the acquisition of Hawaii. Now, you have to understand, Hawaii was an independent kingdom in the 1870s. In the 1860s, 1870s, they had negotiated a trade agreement with the United States to allow free export of sugar cane from Hawaii to the United States. Now, this seemed like a good deal at the time, and it probably was on paper. But what happened next was rich Anglo businessmen, settlers, began to flood into the islands. And by the 1880s, they began to dominate not only the sugarcane industry, but also because of their economic clout, they dominated politics. And when in 1893, the Queen of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, she tried to eliminate white influence. So she sees the problem. Anglo-Americans have come to her country, independent kingdom, and are basically usurping control. Sound familiar, like Texas? And when she tries to push back against their influence, they lead a rebellion to overthrow the queen. And this planter class, these rich Anglo elites, will lead a rebellion led by a man by the name of Sanford Dole. Yes, Dole pineapples, Dole plantation. Sanford Dole leads this revolt to oust the queen, proclaiming Hawaii an independent republic and begging to be annexed by the United States. Wow, this is just like Texas. Just like New Mexico, where they took over from the Mexicano elites. And eventually, by 1898, it will be annexed by the United States. Now, one of the main goals of our expansion of Manifest Destiny across the ocean was the goal of getting to China. The plan was we needed to get to China in order to get into their lucrative trade markets. And the thought was if we could get to those trade markets, we might be able to prevent recessions in the United States. We may be able to raise wages to prevent workers from getting upset by cutting wages back. And so by 1898, we were trying to formulate a plan to get to China. And so we went to war with Spain. Now, officially, the Spanish-American War of 1898 is a war against Spain to help Cuba achieve its independence. Because the reality is, by 1898, the United States was trading more with Cuba than Spain was. Again, Cuba's 80 some miles off the coast of Florida. It's relatively close. We are the number one trading partner by 1898. And the Cubans themselves were trying to overthrow their Spanish overlords. And so in 1898, we joined with Cuba to help oust the Spanish. Now, the Spanish-American War of 1898 is termed the quote-unquote splendid little war. The reality is it only lasted, it's like a long summer. It started in April of 1898. It was done by August. The U.S. won and will pay $20 million to Spain, not only for temporary control of a newly liberated Cuba, but also get the territories of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Again, it's a rare moment we're trying to help another country achieve independence, yes. But the outcome of this was we were able to essentially become an imperial nation, become an empire. Yes, we help Cuba. Yes, we get Puerto Rico, which is lucrative later. Guam will become a military base later. But the prize for us was the Philippines. This was right on the next door to China. This was a stepping stone to get to China. And we immediately look at how to take control of the Philippines. Listen to what President McKinley described, how he described what happens next. He says, quote, "There was nothing left for us to do but to take them all these colonies, again, Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and to educate them and to Christianize them. And by God's grace, do the very best we could for them, as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. Unquote. How quaint. First of all, it's the assumption that, once again, manifest destiny, believing that the United States has the superior culture and civilization that needs to be spread. It's very egotistical. And driven in part by religion, McKinley and his supporters believed that both Filipinos and Puerto Ricans were incapable of self-governing and needed the United States to come in to, quote unquote, civilize their islands, to raise them up, to Christianize them and educate them and raise them up to a level of self-governance. But of course, that assumption, that premise, is predicated on the fact that once you do that, you leave. Checking my watch, it's 2021, and we still control the Puerto Rico. It will take more than 40-some years to allow Filipinos to have their independence. But here's the thing. We have large populations in Puerto Rico and the Philippines. The United States, taking these over, created new, conquered, colonized people who, if you think about it, in the case of Puerto Rico, also speak Spanish. And if you have ever been around any Filipino people, you'll understand there's a lot of Spanish influence in their language due to being controlled by the Spanish for hundreds of years. The fact is, though, Anglo-Americans did not readily distinguish between Filipinos, Puerto Ricans, or Mexicanos. To Anglo-Americans, all these groups, again, Filipinos, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicanos, all these groups were, in their minds, low caste descendants of Indios, Indians, mixed with black blood, creating a new subaltern group that was only fit, racially suited, designed by God, only fit for toiling in the fields and mines. Indeed, in future lectures, we will talk more about the Filipino Mexicano group when we get to the great boycotts of the 50s and 60s. And what this war does for Mexicanos is further degrade and stigmatize Mexicanos in the United States, because they are lumped together with Puerto Ricans and Filipinos. And again, people in the United States generally do not distinguish, even today. The common assumption is that if you speak Spanish, you must be Mexican. Well, that's quite offensive if you're someone from Honduras or Guatemala or Puerto Rico. Again, these are separate nations. But Anglo-Americans, even today, do not make that distinction most generally. Now, there's a lot more I could say about this, so we will continue this conversation later. But I want to turn to the other big phase of U.S. history that the United States entered into at the turn of the century, and that is progressivism. Now, imperialism was dealing with things abroad, but back stateside, people were still trying to clean up that crap of the Gilded Age. And the progressive era is all about trying to clean up that crap. You see, the populist movement we talked about last time was deemed too radical because of its lofty ideals. Things like government take over railroads, right? But also because it's also deemed too radical because it was often led by people or members of the poorer, lower classes. But as the calendar begins to turn to a new century, middle-class white reformers begin to take up that mantle. And suddenly the reform efforts became more respectable. And we term this not the populist movement, but rather progressivism. So what is progressivism? Definition is on the screen. It is an umbrella term that describes a variety of responses to the economic and social problems of the Gilded Age. It rejects social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was this idea that survival of the fittest, that if you are not succeeding in life, if you are poor, it's your fault. You're too lazy. You don't work hard enough. You made bad choices. You're immoral. You are living a sinful life and God is punishing you. That's social Darwinism. The problem is it ignores the reality that society puts people in certain positions. And progressives finally came to understand and accept that social Darwinism is a myth that rich people use to blame poor people for their position in life. But one of the other big things that progressivism was that it emphasized government intervention to address inequalities and problems. And so this becomes the big thing is, remember, the late 19th century, they still was very much that kind of crappy president by design with laissez-faire economic policy, laissez-faire capitalism, hands off. Again, we know that was not really hands off, but that's what they believed. Progressivism, however, says, no. Government needs to reform things, to make things more equal for all people, to curb the worst excesses of capitalism, to create some type of safety net for the average person when things go bad. And we're going to get some very important things like the direct election of senators. The populist idea, we will get that in the progressive era. We will see a number of progressives begin to create settlement houses to help immigrants, to help them assimilate better, to help them find work. We will also find modest reforms for workers. Things like you are not allowed to lock exit doors during the work time in case of a fire. A fire escape needs to be maintained to escape in the event of a fire. Safety inspections by the city. And what made this movement very different from the populist movement was these were largely white. They weren't people of color. They were middle class. And they're embracing regulation, not revolution. So when you hear things like the Knights of Labor saying we want government takeover of the railroads and utilities, that sounds like revolution. That sounds like socialist takeover. Progressives were much more acceptable, palatable. But at the federal level, the question became, how do you implement these large changes to clean up that crap of the Gilded Age? And what it really came down to is how do we define our government? Now, the U.S. had long debated the role of government. Big government, small government, right? That's been the story of U.S. history. We took a good U.S. history course since the end of the Revolution. Traditionally, though, there was kind of two extreme forms of government. There was our version, which was the laissez-faire, hands-off capitalism, or there was the socialist route, which was the government ownership of businesses. And it was seen we have to protect laissez-faire capitalism. We don't want to become socialist. But you have to believe me, by the early 1900s, socialism was huge. It was all the rage. The American Socialist Party was alive and well. It was formed officially in 1901, had a peak of more than 115,000 members. In fact, in 1912, more than 1,200 socialists were holding public elected offices. A socialist candidate for president in 1912 earned 6% of the popular vote. So socialism was a very real thing in the United States at the turn of the century. And it was seen by many as a viable alternative to clean up that crap of the Gilded Age, to get rid of the worst excesses of capitalism. So again, we have the extreme. We have either unfettered, unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism, or we have socialism. But there was a third option, a quote-unquote middle way. And this is the one that was pursued by most of the progressive reformers. Their decision was to find a halfway middle point. It was to keep capitalism, to keep large corporations in place, but to regulate them, to place restrictions and regulations. So no government ownership here. And this is what's going to be embraced by these middle-class reformers, many of whom were business owners themselves, because it promised stabilization and continuity. And when Theodore Roosevelt, hero of the Spanish-American War, becomes president in 1901, he will embark in a dramatic reimagining of what it means to be president. The crappy, by design, presidents of the 19th century were gone. Teddy Roosevelt, the only 20th century president enshrined on Mount Rushmore, helped to institute this idea of regulated capitalism. For instance, in 1902, he ordered the Justice Department to prevent the merger of two major railroad companies, arguing they would create a monopoly and raise the cost of travel. Again, this is the first time the government has intervened to prevent large corporations from merging. The government is getting involved here to regulate, not take over. Likewise, in 1902, this is a great story. The United Mine Workers Union in West Virginia, in Pennsylvania, walked off the job in a coal strike. Again, they're protesting the usual things. They want a wage increase, they want a reduction in hours, and they also want recognition of the union. Again, you need them to recognize the union to create stability and make it legitimate, right? And so 1902, the United Mine Workers Union walk off the job in both Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Teddy Roosevelt, however, rather than send in the military, which has been the trend thus far, right? We've discussed this. Rather than send in the military, which is the traditional way that the president has dealt with things, instead called both sides to the White House and hosted a conference between the owners and the workers. And the strangest thing happened. Theodore Roosevelt immediately sympathized with the workers. In fact, it was said that he was enraged by the, quote, extraordinary stupidity and temper of the wooden-headed mine operators, unquote. It was even said that he wanted to grab the mine operator spokesman by the seat of his britches and chuck him out the White House window. Now, first of all, it's hilarious to think about. The president wants to take the man and throw him out the window just for being stupid. But here you have the president for the first time in really history siding with workers. Now, ultimately, this conference ends in a stalemate, an impasse. And both parties start to leave the White House. But as they were leaving, Theodore Roosevelt leaned over and told the mine operator, saying, hey, if you don't settle this, we're going to have the government take over the mines. And they're like, what? Now, a congressman immediately said, sir, you can't do that. It's unconstitutional. Teddy Roosevelt responded saying, quote, to hell with the Constitution when people want coal, unquote. But here's the thing. Constitutionality aside, it was not constitutional. The mine owners were so scared that he might actually try this, to use the military not to help the mine operators, but to take over the mine, that they did agree to reopen the mine, that they would give in to some of the union's demands. Now, what they got was a reduction to a 9-hour workday. They did get a 10% wage increase. They wanted 20. They got partial victory, but they did not get the recognition of the union. But again, this is an example of Roosevelt's expansion of the executive branch. And for the first time, the president is siding with the workers. Again, compare this to the response to all those strikes we talked about last time. Now, one of the other big things of this era was a new form of journalism. And it's one of the things that helped spur both the imperialist movement, Spanish-American War, and the progressive movement. So both imperialism and progressivism were spurred and helped and egged on by both newspapers and journalism. In fact, there were two new forms of journalism that developed during the late 19th century, early 20th century. They were called yellow journalism and muckraking journalism. And both are going to play an integral role in both imperialism and progressivism. And something that's going to be embraced heavily by Mexicanos. Let's start with yellow journalism. So one of the motivations for both President McKinley and the American public to actually enter the Spanish-American War was the development of yellow journalism. Now, it was popularized by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. You may have heard of Pulitzer, the Pulitzer Prize for Best Journalism writing. These journalists were known to publish sensationalistic headlines of shocking stories in order to increase circulation of the newspapers. In other words, get people to buy it. Sometimes they were even accused of embellishing certain details to get readership. To put this in modern vernacular, this would be called clickbait journalism. So you read it on the screen right now, you see some headlines from the Spanish-American War. Crisis is at hand. Spanish treachery. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of the enemy. Again, this is stuff that gets people's attention, gets readership, it gets clicks. In addition, this type of sensationalistic headlines is one of the things that's going to help convince the American people and the American government to join the Spanish-American War, to enter the war and fight against the Spanish. Clickbait journalism, yellow journalism. The second form of journalism was called muckraking journalism. Because while yellow journalism will also play a part, progressivism was mostly spurred forward by muckraking journalists who would expose the worst atrocities of the Gilded Age with exposés. One of the most famous examples of this was the man in the bottom left of your screen, Jacob Reese. Jacob Reese was an immigrant, but he worked his way up and he became a photographer for the newspaper in New York. And he would do the crime beat. And he would go into the lower slum areas of New York and photograph crime. And while he was there, though, he began to take pictures of just how poorly these immigrants were living. They were living in squalor, overcrowded, in slum tenement housing. And he published a book on it. And not only did he caption it with pictures so people could see, because again, it's a big difference between reading about something as bad and seeing it. And he showed Americans how bad life was for immigrants. And then in the words next to it, he would say, but this is not their fault. This is not social Darwinism playing out. This is because there's no sewer system, there's no running water, there's no heat in these buildings. These houses and tenement housing is atrocious. That's one example. A second example is Upton Sinclair, who published a historical fiction book known as The Jungle in 1906, exposing the truths about industrial America, the poor treatment of immigrant workers, the impoverished living conditions, the unsafe working conditions, job insecurity, and the low wages paid to immigrants. And what he did was he wrote this book as a fiction book, but exposing the atrocities of the meatpacking industry in Chicago. It told the fictitious story of a Eastern European family coming over the United States and trying to make a life for themselves and basically being pushed down at every turn by the system in place. But it also included things like how poorly Chicago meatpacking industry took care of their meat, including things like they stored it in unrefrigerated warehouses for weeks. And it was said that you could walk into this dark room and run your hand across the beef, and all your hand would come up with is rat droppings. And these rat droppings were being sold to the American public as part of the meat. Well, what this did, though, was it created public outcry. And President Theodore Roosevelt was able to use the government once again to act. And they would pass the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 that would prohibit the adulteration of food using fillers. You couldn't use filthy, decomposed, or vile substances to prolong the life of tainted beef. It led to the creation of the FDA. Again, this is an example of government regulation on the economy. This is progressive. This is progressivism. The government is not taking away the power or the control from the meatpacking industry, but providing some rules and regulations so they can provide good quality food for the American public. So what does all this have to do with Mexicanos? Well, I took a lot of time, I know, but to set the stage for what is going on in the early 20th century. The thing is, though, is Mexicanos saw this. And for the first time, they see a government and a society that seemed to be more reform-minded, that seemed to embrace the idea of reform, to help out the little guy, the average American. And the Mexicanos themselves would use the sensationalistic headlines of yellow journalism and muckraking journalism to help spur their own reform movements. Now, to be clear, though, we're not talking about in this lecture, but Anglos would also use those sensationalistic headlines against Mexican Americans, such as with the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution in the 19 teens, a topic for next time. But I want to talk about muckraking, and I want to talk about the Spanish language press for a minute. And we'll go into more detail in future lectures regarding the Spanish language press. But Spanish language journalism in the United States became a primary form of Mexican American expression at the turn of the 20th century to expose the larger issues of society, as well as to publish local events, report on the state of things in Mexico, to pass along advice, to act as a forum for artistic expression, and to provide editorialized attempts to expose Anglo injustice. And so the Spanish language press becomes this primary outlet to, one, expose the worst excesses of society, just like Anglos were doing, to provide artistic expression, to provide information, to provide local events, but also to connect people to Mexico itself. And a number of newspapers begin to develop. Again, these aren't necessarily always new in, say, 1900 specifically, but around this era, this is the era of the advent of the Spanish language press in the United States. One very famous one is Lavos del Pueblo, that was published weekly in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Translated The People's Voice, it began publishing in 1890 and would be published once a week through 1927. Lavos del Pueblo would be published every Saturday, and its motto explains its dedication, which was to, quote, the interest and progress of the Spanish American people, unquote. Early issues were only 4 pages long, covered mainly local news, but soon included sections on literature, and it was almost exclusively in Spanish. Yes, it would cover some national and international news, such as the Spanish-American War. But by 1917, by the time World War I hits, the paper had increased to 8 pages, divided into sections, still in Spanish, covering local, national, and international news, but also editorials, literature, agriculture, health, and even beauty. And of course, injustices against Mexicanos in that area. Or take La Prensa, you see on your left. This was a San Antonio Spanish language newspaper that began publishing in 1913 and would continue publishing all in 1963. Originally, it was conceived as the voice of, quote, El México de afuera, unquote, Mexico abroad. The goal of La Prensa initially was to link the community of Mexicanos in the United States with the homeland of Mexico. It provided coverage of Mexican national events, as well as analysis and even some criticisms. It would announce activities for both Mexican and Mexican-American organizations. And it always reflected an admiration and even reverence for Mexico and its people. Again, it was the voice of Mexicans abroad. That was the idea, or of Mexico abroad. The idea was to connect Mexican Americans, or Mexicans living in the United States, back to the homeland. And yes, it would also help defend both Mexican and Mexican Americans from abuse. But above all, La Prensa promoted and expressed a patriotic fervor for the homeland. This became a daily newspaper with a circulation of more than 10,000 issues. And this was especially important during the Mexican Revolution in the 1910s, a topic for next time. But by the 1920s, it would increasingly add more and more Mexican American events that weren't always just about connecting back to Mexico, but about how to be a Mexican American. So we can see this transition with the newspapers. Now, one of the most prominent muckraking journalists of the time was Jovita Idar. She was born in Laredo, Texas in 1885. One of 8 children. Her father was a newspaper editor and a civil rights advocate. From a very early age, Idar was exposed to journalism and political activism. She would earn a teaching certificate in 1903 and immediately began teaching, but soon resigned due to segregation and poor conditions for the Mexican American students in the segregated Mexican school. During this time, the Mexican American community in Texas also frequently was facing violence and lynchings. Talked about that a little bit last time. Idar started working for her father's newspaper, La Crónica, where 2 of her brothers were already working. The paper was a source of news and activism for Mexican American rights. She often would write articles speaking out against racism and supporting the revolution that was going on in Mexico during the 19-teens. Idar would write an article for La Crónica supporting women's suffrage, encouraging women to vote. This is the women's suffrage movement. Idar and her brother began to advocate for women's rights and would continue to write about women's suffrage in a positive light, joining their Anglo counterparts. In October of 1911, she founds and becomes the first president of La Liga Femenil Mexicanista, the League of Mexican Women. This feminist organization started their activism by providing education for Mexican American students. She then went to work for another newspaper, El Progreso. She wrote an article protesting President Woodrow Wilson's decision to send troops to the border of Mexico. We'll talk about that next time. The United States Army and Texas Rangers did not like that she was speaking out against this. So when she writes this article criticizing President Wilson for sending U.S. troops to the Texas-Mexican border, the U.S. Army and Texas Rangers did not like that she, as a foreigner, a Mexicano, again, she's not Mexican, she's Mexican-American. So as a Mexicana, she is viewed as a woman, as an outsider, as a Spanish speaker, and someone speaking against the president and the military. They sent troops to her office of El Progreso to shut it down. Now, when the Rangers arrived, Idar stood in front of the door and would not allow the Texas Rangers to enter the building, using herself as a human barricade. And for a short time, she won. They did leave. Now, they would return later and forced El Progreso to shut down. But even though the Rangers would shut down El Progreso, Idar would continue to write and advocate for the fair treatment of Mexican Americans. She went back to La Crónica and soon started running the newspaper when her father passed away in 1914. Later, she would start a free kindergarten for Mexicano children. She was known for saying, quote, "When you educate a woman, you educate a family," unquote. She's a muckraker, just like Jacob Reese, just like Upton Sinclair. She was trying to expose the horrors of society and trying to figure out how to clean it up. Now, we're going to stop here and we're going to come back, but I want to note that newspapers will play an increasingly large role in helping to create a Mexican-American cultural identity. But when we come back, I want to talk about how Mexican and Mexican-Americans fared in their push for progressive reforms during this era. So, until then, take care and bye-bye.